Still a few of the last remaining giants who are with us, people who don't look at the law through narrow, specialized lenses and silos, but people who see broad terrain and look across it. Such a figure is exactly what this conference calls for, and we're fortunate to have someone who really helped reinvent the field of property, as well as torts, as well as constitutional law. And someone who finds these sorts of questions interesting is a special person. What I want to say, though, is not only Richard an amazing and really exceptionally productive scholar, he's a phenomenal human being. And so what you may get a chance to if you talk to the reception him is get a sense of his spirit. He gives academics a good name. And it's not the easiest time for the academy these days. We need role models and people whose spirit and whose interesting questioning reminds us why our teachers and scholars are so valuable. And that's my introduction for Richard Epstein.
Actually, I'm not sure which introduction I prefer, Phil's or the one that Frank Easterbrook gave to me some weeks ago at a Federalist Society meeting, where he said, Richard Epstein is sufficiently well known that he needs no introduction, and therefore I will give him none. I kind of like that one, actually. It sort of gets it to the point, and it's nice to be here. As you can tell, I've managed to have an immense amount of time to prepare this talk and to organize all the details. But I am going to try and do this. And what's always odd about these conferences is that people like to talk about water, and they like to talk about patents, and they like to talk about spectrum, and they rarely talk about land in any of its particular ways, and yet it is, of course, part of the general picture. And so to start this talk, I think the first question you have to ask is a very profound one, which is, how do we think about the distribution between private and common rights with respect to property? And some people will say, well, this is a very modern question, but of course it is not. If you go back and you read Justinian, and I should tell you, Roman law is one of my specialties, it begins the discussion of property with the distinction between the res commune on the one hand, that is property which is open to all in a state of nature, and the res nullius, that which could be acquired by a single individual through occupation or possession of some sort. And they sort of give the water and the beach and the air as illustrations of the res commune, and they give land, chattels, and animals as the instances of the res nullius. They do not have any theory about why it is that you put one thing into another, and so as was typical in ancient legal systems, whenever you don't know the answer, you announce that it's a function of at least two things. One of these is natural reason, and the other turns out to be custom, and you don't explain how reason or custom actually work. And so what you need to do essentially is to take this distinction, to understand that it has been ingrained in our system of property right in all areas from the beginning of time, and then ask the very difficult question, what are the kinds of trade-offs which lead you to think that something is going to go on one side of the line and something is going to go on the other side of the line? And it turns out, I think, there is a fairly interesting way to describe the problem, and it's essentially, it's the battle forever between the externality problem on the one hand and the holdout problem on the other. And so what happens is, if you listen to the discussions that we have, somebody starts to create something, and what he does has spillover effects on other kinds of individuals. And if it turns out that you treat something as a common, there's really nothing much that you can do about the spillover. Everybody is kind of in this thing together. And what we call ours is something that we can pollute each other to our happiness and our self-content. But on the other hand, if we start to create private rights in property and therefore give people the ability through trespass and nuisance actions to bring suits against somebody else, we now create the alternative problem, namely the blockade problem. And so what happens is, if we want to configure a river so that it's owned privately by a bunch of individuals, the value of the river comes in communications from top to bottom. And if it turns out that you can block it here and block it there and block it somewhere else, a price system through compensation to get you back to an open river is extremely costly to do. And so what we essentially realize is that We have to make some kind of a decision as to polar cases. Then we have to ask whether or not we can move the polar cases a little bit in the opposite direction by the natural law or sort of general legal doctrine. And then further, we have to talk about something which nobody seems to want to talk about today. Because I listened fairly hard to all of the speeches, and nobody seemed to think that just compensation by way of payment was a dominant mechanism by which you could redefine rights if it turns out, for some particular reason, they became obsolescent or inefficient. And this, I think, is an important part of the trouble. So now if you start looking at this, I'm going to take the three topics that we had, and I'm going to sort of treat them in order of their historical evolution. There was no Roman law of patents and copyrights. You paid people to copy things that you had, and invention was not an organized science. So that is not the first field. The first field is water law, of which there's a very strong ancient body of rules. Patents come second, and the spectrum comes third. And so let me just sort of point out the ways in which these things interact. And if you want to understand the distribution between the commons and the private, what I like to do is to sort of think about the way in which the human body is organized, because that becomes a template on the way in which the larger society is organized. And we basically have two kinds of systems in our bodies. We have the long and skinny, and we have the short and squat. And the long and skinny are the neural systems on the one hand and the blood systems on the other. And the short and squat are, in fact, the organs which have various kinds of specialization. And what happens is if you don't have long and skinny, there is no way in which you can communicate from one solid organ to another. So there's no way in which you can keep these things together. But if you only have a bunch of roadways going back and forth, there'll be no productive sites which will allow for digestion, mentation, and all sorts of other functions. So what the body does is it basically divides itself into a commons, which is designed to deal with the communication stuff, and then all these productive storehouses of energy and given hard organs, which essentially allow for specialized development. Well, when you start looking at the society and the jus naturale, that's essentially what these guys were worried about. It turns out that rivers and beaches and trails and all that stuff are long and skinny. These are the ways in which you try to get communications going back and forth between given kinds of individuals. If you allow for privatization, it turns out there's very little, at least at the beginning, that you can do by way of improvement of the resource, but there's an enormous amount of harm that you could do by way of blockade. So the initial position in virtually all of these cases is these things are open to all. Well, what do we mean by all in the original situation? Well, remember, the term that I used at the beginning was the jus naturale, and that means there's no political society around in any way, shape, or form. So open to all under these circumstances means anybody in the entire universe. And what happened early on is that with densities being relatively low, people would go back and forth up and down a river one way or another. It turns out that there was very little organization of the commons that tended to take place. And as a general rule, commons do not become organized when intensity of uses are low. And so nobody really tried to figure out how it is that you manage the common under these early systems, because the issue never came up. With private property, where you develop it, divide it, and trade it, and so forth, you do get from a very early time a lot of very distinctive rules upon that particular subject, which talk about exclusive use, the ability to develop, the ability to sell, to mortgage, and so forth, and the like. Now, when you start out with these particular situations, these are first approximations. And then the question is, do you want to make any kind of change in them? And certainly with respect to rivers, everybody had that, because there was a sense that if you could simply use the waters for transportation, but you couldn't drink from it, or you couldn't fish, or so forth, then in effect the inability to have any consumptive uses would sharply reduce the values in question. And so what people did is they developed very intuitive systems. The riparian systems came first. The prior appropriation systems come much, much later, in which you can say you're allowed to take as much as you can out of the particular river so long as you don't manage to destroy its essential nature. And then what you do is you prorate those particular uses amongst the various riparians by way of a customary law, because when you have large numbers of people along a river, it is simply impossible for them by contract to agree on a particular form of allocation. And so what one does is develop historically a focal point equilibrium in which proration turns out to be the dominant theme. And then the moment you do that, you realize since rivers flow in one direction or another, there are serious asymmetries from the people at the top and the bottom, and you develop situations where the folks on the top can't gobble it all up, and the people on the bottom are not allowed to insist that it all come to them unimpeded, and you have these genuine problems of how you keep proration going in a system of asymmetry. With respect to land, it turns out there are also approximations. At the borderline, many times we have reciprocal obligations of support so that I can build on my land and you can build on yours, but we can't cut out the land in such a way that our neighbors fall in. So again, what we do is we now start with the isolated, hard boundary line, and all of a sudden we soften it. And the theory is that each and every one of these kinds of alterations that we create, largely in a state of nature or by customary law, leave both parties to the transaction better than they would have been in the land case, and leave everybody using the river better off than they would have been in the other situation. Now, it is often said that when you look at the Roman law, it was the origin of the public trust doctrine when it announced that the rivers were jus commune. That is a desperate mistake and a complete confusion of the way in which the particular systems have worked. As I've mentioned to you, a system of the jus commune is an open system in a state of nature. A public trust doctrine necessarily starts to require a sovereign to run the thing in question. And so the issues that you have to explain is, why do you put this sovereign in charge of this particular collective enterprise, and what is that sovereign supposed to do? Well, the explanation turns out to be roughly as follows. When you start with a river in a state of nature, everybody can use it, but nobody's under an obligation to maintain it. And as you have constant use, you have constant careless use of one form or another. As densities start to become heavier, you run the risk of collisions and various forms of confusion taking place. And so somebody says, we need to have some way in which we can control the commons, not for the purpose of excluding people, but for the purpose of organizing their activities so as to maximize its use when densities start to become very serious. You then look around at a bunch of private parties, and none of them really seem to fit that particular bill. Which one should take over and why? So what you then say is, here's the sovereign, and its job is basically to improve the operation of the river, but not to engage in activities which result in the exclusion of any other person. This is a very big and a complicated situation, because now you have to raise tax revenues and you have to put various kinds of rules in question. And if you start to alter the balance sufficiently, it may generate what we call in modern terms a takings problem. So one of the really dreadful features of American constitutional law is the so-called navigation servitude, which takes a river which has all sorts of correlative interests exquisitely balanced, says the federal government comes in, it can be the bully and wipe out all riparian rights, and it doesn't have to compensate anybody. The correct view of the public trust doctrine is you preserve those rights along with every others. You're trying to make social improvements. You're not trying to create situations where the wipeout can take place through the Bureau of Engineering, the Bureau of the Army Corps, or any other institution of that particular sort. But then there are other kinds of problems that happen with respect to this, which are also worth talking about. One is, can you sell public resources to private parties? And this is where the just compensation formula really comes into place. If you go back and you look at the Illinois Central case having to deal with that, it was generally decided by a court that the public assets are inherently public and they cannot be sold at all. This turns out to be, I think, an extremely restrictive rule, because sometimes you keep things in public solution which are more efficient in private solution. And what you need to do is to have what I like to call the kind of business test that you use in corporate transaction. And this is a rule which says, nor shall private property be given, or public property be given to private use without just compensation. So the theory is you don't want the state to give this stuff away, but if in fact the balance when all things are looked at leaves the public better off with the new development than without it, with or without compensation being paid, then you'd be willing to go ahead. A rule of inalienability turns out to be too restrictive under these circumstances. A rule that you could do whatever you want turns out to be too permissive, and so you take the intermediate position and you want to follow it. The second problem you have is, well, just how far does the public trust doctrine go? And here's a classic illustration how not to understand it. And I'm referring to a case from the state of New Jersey in 1984, where they said the public trust doctrine extends not only to free access up and down the river, but also allows individuals to get to the river across easements that are placed on private lands. Now, what's the difference and why is that decision wrong? Well, keeping the river open essentially is a situation where you're trying to blockade. But there isn't any blockade under these circumstances. And the real question you have to ask is how many access points to a river do you really need? If the state can claim them all at zero price, it will claim every last one of them. If, in fact, you say, look, you want to get access to the river, we will condemn some piece of private land. You could then use that as an entryway into the situation. Now the state is going to have to ration its resources, and it will not over-condemn. There is, in this particular point, given the takings power, no real holdout. And since, in fact, we don't know which of these adjunct places is the one that belongs to the river and which one does not, we can't use the public trust doctrine, which is perfectly sensible for keeping the flow of the river open. When you come to a place like Colorado, it turns out that the riparian system, basically speaking, stinks. And the explanation that I like to give is, well, you've got the Grand Canyon and you bring your cows to the edge of the Grand Canyon and you expect them to drink the water out of the river. It's not going to work. So what you had is this famous 1882 case called Conf against the Left-Hand Ditch Company, in which the Supreme Court of the Colorado, in a heroically realist tradition, shatters the old system of rights and puts in a prior appropriation system. And as we sort of heard, this is kind of tricky because the Constitution seems to guarantee that waters are public, and then the purpose of keeping them public is to allow them to go private by way of prior appropriation. So there's a little bit of neuroses in the way in which the basic doctrine is done. Now, what was interesting about the Coffin versus Left-Hand Ditch Company case is that the trade-off here was between one system of private rights and water and another, and what the Supreme Court said is we know in our guts, and they were right about this, that riparianism is a weak system, prior appropriation is a better system. But as time goes on, there are now problems with prior appropriation. It was mentioned, I think, by several people on the last panel, particularly Mark Squas, Professor. What he said is, the private appropriation system is a system which prizes consumption out of the river above all other things. And indeed, if you go back to the Frank Treelys, who was the sort of major water theorist in the mid part of the last century, that's exactly the view that he had. Water was to be used for consumption. In-stream values did not mount to anything. Well, this represents a colossal misunderstanding of the way in which these things should work. And remember, I'm not a kind of a socialist type like Mr. Mackey, perhaps, but nonetheless, I think he's right. You cannot think of a river in a place like Colorado today in which the in-stream uses have no particular value and always ought to be subordinated to the irrigation uses. The question, though, is how do you make the transition? And this is a much harder question than it was when you were dealing with Coffin and against the Left-Hand Ditch Company under these circumstances, because now it's not so obvious as to how much better off you are with the water in stream or out. What we do know, if you listen to the discussion, is that we have this perverse system on the appropriation system where you get an amount of appropriation, you consume part of it, and it turns out that the more you consume, the more you get to keep, because if you wanted to sell the right, somehow or other you're not going to be able to sell the whole thing. So what do I want you to do? I think before one starts to think about sort of socializing solutions, what you have to think is rationalizing the system of property rights. And here's what I would recommend that one do. As you look at the system and you say what we are going to do when we buy or sell is to pay you for the amount of water that you can take out of the river, not for the amount of water in any sense that you consume. And you can sell back to us any fraction of this water that you choose, and we'll have to agree upon a price. And of course, as we all know, dealing with rivers, where you are on the river may influence the value of the water when it's put back into the stream. So we work this out. And when you sell us to what? And then what you can do is keep the residual. Now, what's going to happen if you allow them to sell it? Now, they have absolutely no incentive whatsoever to inflate their water uses for fear of losing them. They have exactly the opposite incentive. Since they can sell off the stuff that they no longer need, what they will start to do is to shift to all sorts of other devices. One of the techniques you could use is better irrigation. Another one you could start thinking about is GMO crops, which I generally tend to support. And the theory there is you can make species in which the amount of water that you need for unit of output could be reduced by 30 or 40%. 0%. So by getting the right structure on the property rights and not have any demands on private property owners that they just surrender these things, what will happen is that the market will re-equilibrate in a sensible fashion. One of the things that can happen is folks like Mackey and Company, they can go out and actually buy these rights and put them inside the river and protect them under these circumstances. This is exactly what Nature Conservancies do with respect to land, and there's no reason why you can't do it with respect to water. The state can, in effect, appropriate budgets to bring things back. And so long as you make sure that the sales are rational from both sides of the transaction, you should be able to make improvements of the stock, even if you cannot abstractly expand its size for whatever reasons it turns out. And remember, we do talk about here a decline in the amount of water by something like 20% over previous times. So the key feature, it seems to me, in this particular program is to understand the public choice dynamic, and that's a dynamic which says that if I'm going to either take it from you or not take it from you, there's going to be a huge amount of conflict because the guy who loses is going to lose big. If you throw in the compensation formula, the resistance should melt away because now you increase the possibility of having a Pareto improvement. That is a situation in which both sides are left better off than they were before. So it's absolutely critical in these particular cases to think about the definition of the property rights, not only in terms of the historical origins, but in ways that start to facilitate exchanges. And the last point that I would make about the water under these circumstances is that when we do these kinds of allocation, there is an effort in many cases to say what we really have to do is to subsidize small parties. This is in fact something like the infant industries situation in places like in California, in the Fresno River area and so forth. You can get water if you pay for it out of the system at a tiny fraction of its fair market value. Subsidies distort. They distort in water like they do everything else. And so to the extent that the government is making sales contracts, what it has to do is to remember the public trust doctrine and apply it here. You can sell this stuff off, but you have to get just compensation back in return. And you don't do that when you start making giveaways to your friends. And once, in effect, you put the compensation system in there, you will see that the demands will start to shift very radically downward, and that the ability to use substitute technologies to improve yields from land that don't depend upon government water will start to increase as well. So it seems to me that if you understand the compensation formula, it gives you, at least in many cases, a way in which you could ease the cost of transition from a less to a more rational system. Now, it turns out when you start to move towards the patent system, you also have a problem about the distribution of the commons and the private stuff. And it's not only patents, it's copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets, and so forth. And essentially what happens is there is a very clear notion of the public domain, and I'm in it right now using the English language without paying anybody anything for anyone. So I'm going to tell you a story about how I figured out the public domain, and it involves my daughter when she was the age 5. And what happened is we were riding home, and we start to spell names, and we come to her name, Melissa. We say M-E, and when the E comes out, she bursts into tears. And we say, Melissa, why are you so upset about the E? And she looks, and she's crying, and the tears, and she says, I need to save the E for Rachel's name. Now, what was she thinking, my daughter? This is actually a very serious point. She had these magnetic letters, right, which you put on the wall, and it turns out now they're a scarce quantity. And if you take the E and you put it in Melissa, you can't put it in Rachel. Remember, it has an E in it as well. So she was justified about the fact that it was now being allocated the wrong way. But what's nice about language, as I tried to explain to her, I said, my dear, to my 5-year-old, do you know that when it comes to ordinary language, they are Platonic forms in which you have an infinite supply at a zero price? And she looked at me somewhat dubious, was convinced that I was doing something wrong. But when I bring it into an adult audience, all of a sudden people understand. You will always put things into the common to the extent they satisfy that particular kind of requirement. Because at that point, you've got all the E's in the world that you need, and if you don't give anybody the right to them, so forth, you'll just keep using them, and any other language that you develop will have exactly the same thing. What's the advantage of it is since people don't control the language, essentially it becomes a commons, and we can circulate back and forth without paying any cost one way or the other. So you have to have essentially a commons protected from all forms of private intellectual property if you're going to have human discourse. Then the question is, what else falls into this other than ordinary language? And the customary answers that you would give to this would be scientific laws and mathematical theorems and sort of natural compounds and elements. You can't patent plutonium, as it were, or polonium or gold or silver. They're out there in some natural form. You have not added the inventive step. So the great challenge in this particular system is how do you build a private system of property rights where you need it around this? And the form of property rights that was not mentioned at all in this particular course was trade secrets. And the question is, why not? Well, let's suppose that there's something which is held in common and you decide to treat it as a trade secret. Since everybody knows it anyhow before you do it, the trade secret you have is exactly zero. So one, in terms of its value. So trade secrets essentially develop a kind of natural rhythm of their own. The only thing that you wish to make into a trade secret are those things which you wish to keep secret from somebody else, which by definition means that you and only you know them. And so what we do is we develop a system of fairly comprehensive definitions of trade secrets and then allow these things to be traded under promises of confidentiality, understanding always that if somebody else has an independent invention of the trade secret in question, there's nothing that you can do to stop that person from doing it. So we allow the privatization on the one hand and free entry on the other. It turns out the system is actually quite complicated in certain ways because somebody who typically steals a trade secret or gets it by inadvertence will not disclose the trade secret because if he does so, he creates a public good instead of having a duopoly, so that what happens is the whole thing tends to work relatively in quiet. And since many of these trade secrets are processes, people can invent the goods that the trade secrets are useful for making, independent of having it. If it's a recipe, it may be more valuable precisely because it can't be duplicated. And we develop a perfectly sensible way of going around the situation. It is a very difficult question as to whether we should allow independent reverse engineering of trade secrets. By contract, many people try to stop it, and you get the Millennium Copyright Act. My view about it is that's a hard question. I'm not here to talk about hard questions. I'm here to talk about easy questions. Now, why do I want to talk about easy questions? Because if you get those wrong, it's fatal. If you get the hard questions a little bit wrong, you can survive the errors and then try to tweak it back and forth, as we do in that particular area. But it is striking to realize that copyrights, patents, and to some extent trade names and trademarks all respect the commons, which is all to the good. The question is, where do you start to draw the boundaries amongst these things? And let me start to go over them very briefly and give you a kind of a first impression with respect to each of them. First one you talk about is the trademark. And what you note about the trademark, it is always of infinite duration. And the basic point here is if you put a trademark into the commons against the will of its owner, it becomes worthless. Because what the trademark is designed to do is to warrant the quality of the goods produced under the brand. And if anybody can use it, you no longer have that particular form of identification. So the only question you have to ask about the trademark is whether or not its secondary meaning has become a primary meaning so that people cannot talk to one another in the sense that we previously talked about, unless they can use that. So words like Xerox are always running the risk of falling into the public domain until you develop the generic term copier in order to protect the mark. And that, again, is one of these nice questions, and it could lead to very subtle results. It turns out cola goes into the public domain, but Coca hyphen does not. So you get Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola, but you don't get Coca-Cola too. And, is that the right term or the wrong term? Probably the right answer under these circumstances. But secondary meaning is a certain problem. The question is, do we eventually cover the world too much with privatization? And my answer is I'm less pessimistic than some people here because I think the language is always generating new terminology. If you look at the internet age and so forth, we have a whole set of terms that I never quite understand dealing with social media. So the way in which I think you think of this is terms become private in terms of their development on the one hand. Other public terms come in and start to join the language so that in equilibrium, you don't want to think of the springs as never being replenished. You want to think of things going both in and out and you keep it in some kind of a general sort of equilibrium. Now, when it comes to copyrights, essentially there is a real problem, and it's in multiple ports. The first one is, what can you copyright? And there's a requirement of originality. What's interesting about it is it's often misapplied. If you take a case like Fleiss, where they say there's nothing original about a system in which you just list all the phone numbers in order. The problem with that is, you're right, it doesn't fall under copyright protection, but large data sets are very expensive to protect. And if you don't want to call it copyright, then find some other term of property that will protect people from these things, because otherwise, if you have the situation where one person plants the crops and everybody else is being able to harvest it, then you're either going to switch to trade secrets, which are not going to be useful for telephone books, or the thing won't be produced at all. And so, but the first thing you ought to learn is that the copyright universe, particularly with big data, is not a particularly appropriate way in which to deal with it. And as we have new forms of technology, not only ought we to have more things in the common, we ought to have more things that are private. But the same thing works in the opposite direction, and you'll note that there's a fair use exception in the copyright law, which has no analogy in the patent law. And there's probably very good reason for that. The first point to know about the way in which the system works under the copyright law is that fair criticism is always protected by fair use. You cannot criticize a doctrine or an article or literature unless you could quote short passages from it. So if you're not the nation trying to scoop Gerald Ford's biography and you want to quote one of my deathless sentences in prose to tell me what an inept author I am, it's fair game to do so, so long as you don't engage in character assassination at the same time. Although I have to say, in my case, many people are tempted to do the rare double. So you have that particular problem with respect to this. And the point is here, you do not want consensual arrangements to work, because if they do, there'll be selective licensing, and you'll get a rather unbiased, a set of biased estimates. People will discredit it. So strangely enough, fair use is an area in which transactions engaged in between the copyright owner and the critic essentially reduce the value of the criticism to the copyright owner, and so we have it done in the opposite direction. Now, several of you mentioned something else about fair use, which is a much more difficult problem, which is you're now making a documentary on the history of the telephone, and what you'd like to do is to show the old ones in movies and then the new ones, and you want to get, 4-second snippets or 6-second snippets of these things, and not only do you have the telephone there, but there are 4 or 5 other patented objects that are clearly seen in the background and so forth, and now you have to start getting the consent of everybody. And I think it's perfectly clear that when you look at these kinds of uses, they are not competitive with the seller of the original kind of good. So you don't have the direct competition problem, which is what drove the INS case when it came to the appropriation of various kinds of information. This is a 1918 opinion. And that generally speaking, if somebody mentions your stuff, it's going to be by and large favorable to you that they included in this documentary. So there's some kind of compensation that's going to be provided. So the best solution that you would like to have is essentially a series of bright line rules. You look around, I think, at the documentaries that were made before all this stuff became subject to various kinds of government controls of one form or another. And if it turns out there's 6 seconds, the rule is you could use 6 seconds of everything unless the thing that you're using 6 seconds of is the whole thing in question. There's a Zucchini case, which when you show a guy jumping out of a cannon, the whole act takes 4 seconds, and if you show it once, the whole thing's gone. But that's not the case in most of these circumstances. So what you need to do is to have a series of bright line rules, because what happens is the transactions cost needed to overcome the holdout problems becomes really prohibitive. Trying to run a just compensation system for these things becomes almost senseless given the number of parties. Given the indirect compensation, well, fine, you're going to do it. Well, what does this do with things like ASCAP and so forth? Well, it's nice to run these pools so long as you let people go out of it, but one of the things you always have to worry about coercion pools is the reciprocal problem of the documentary, namely, which seems to be the case with music that's produced through these pools, is that the compensation levels are too low relative to what a market should require. And there is no way you can do the compensation game unless you actually know something about the industry in question. But it seems to me that in those cases, at least, the compensation game is perfectly sensible. In the other cases, it's not, which shows you why, again, there's no dominant solution. Compensation is an option. It's not necessarily an obligation in the way in which these systems work together. Now, when you get the patents, there's no reason to have a fair use doctrine and so forth, but there is still the question of what is and is not in the domain. And I think the worst case in this area is a case called Funk against Kalo Brothers from 1948. This was Justice Douglas when he was a grump and very strongly anti-patent. And what happened is some guy found a way in which to create various kinds of spores for production by taking a series of things that were normally incompatible with one another, putting them into a single ball, and making sure that they actually work together. And so it was a very expensive trial and error proposition to see how you assembled these things, and it was a huge technological advance over the other arrangements in which when you wanted to plant these various things, you had to do them separately at high cost. And Justice Douglas said that this was a law of nature. That cannot be right. It's not a law of nature. In fact, it's an empirical hunch done by trial and error, and you never want to make the patent law privatization depend upon inspiration as opposed to perspiration, because remember what our good friend Edison said, most inventions are trial and error and lots of work, and Justice Douglas got that wrong. So what happens is we had the 1952 Patent Act, a remarkable document by Federico and Giles Rich. And, they really got it about right, and they started to talk about non-obvious extensions, right, with respect to patentable subject matter. And I think, for the most part, there was huge improvements in this area through cases like Chakrabarty, which allowed you to patent various kinds of microorganisms, which then led to the DNA revolution, when that stuff, at least the processes and indeed the products, could be protected. What's happened in recent years is the Supreme Court has taken a decidedly narrower view on this subject, and I think it's generally a mistake. If it cost you a fortune to put something together and somebody nothing to imitate it, then generally speaking, I'm going to be inclined to put this stuff into the patentable category, even if I don't fully understand where it ought to belong. So the recent case involving Alice, the communications company, or the trading company, if you can get an input, give a mathematical program, and get an output which is usable, getting real inputs on both ends and outputs on the other end, that seems to me to be enough to patent stuff. That was the position of Giles Rich when he decided cases back in the 90s before he died. He was 90 years old at the time, but very smart. And the Supreme Court, I think, has gone too narrow on this particular stuff. Once you therefore get it, then the real question is, how much do you want to go by way of freebie? And in this particular area, I'm not very sympathetic of the freebie approach. It seems to me that what you want to do is to encourage licensing, and these licensings can take place in a zillion different forms. As I recall, right, I don't know if he's still here now, but Mr. Brenner, right, from Qualcomm, they remember, right? You remember, what, 47 standard-setting organizations, right? And essentially you manage to go in there, get a governance structure, everybody's kind of growling at one another, and, 3 weeks or a month or 2 months later, the technology wins out over the politics, and you come up with a standard, you have friend obligations. It looks kind of messy, but you actually know how it works. And you don't want guys like me telling me that you don't know what you're doing, which is what half the academic profession does in this particular area. And so I've become essentially a person who says you don't try to fix something which isn't broken simply because you don't understand how it starts to work, and that if you wish to encourage the licensing system to flourish, you have to make sure that you don't expand by degrees basically the common domain of the public domain stuff, because then nobody can do it. And in fact, we know if you go back and you look at the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, what happens when you put things into the commons, nobody developed it. So what many people regard as Valhalla with respect to new technology, there's no patent on it. Turns out nothing goes on. So all of a sudden, the government creates a system of options that you could privatize the stuff, either at the university level or at the inventor level, and so long as you give them a license to use it for public affairs. Why are they doing this? Well, they figured out that the public domain is not nirvana. Everybody who wants to work on a technology knows that a rival technology may be out there, and that's one of the uncertainties they have to deal with. But if you put the additional uncertainty that when you work with the technology, you know that everybody else in town could work with that technology as well, that uncertainty may be too great to allow for this, so that privatization, which gives you imperfect protection, may be a better system than the open one. And again, this gets back to the point We don't want to be dogmatic about the primacy of the public use because the commercialization process is rather complicated. And when you see from past experience where public domain stuff fails, you don't want to be write academic articles saying that it always succeeds. And by the way, this is a real battle right now. There's the Goodlotti legislation, more stupid than this I cannot think of in many ways, which is essentially trying to wreck the system of licenses and injunctions because they tend to believe that free access is the dominant solution. They are sadly misinformed as far as I can tell. And it's interesting, it tends to be mainly academics and all the inputters of these things, never the creators of the inventions in question. The American Inventors Act, as we all know, was most vigorously opposed by guess who? American inventors, right? It was very much on the other side. So now what we do is we get to the spectrum. And I'm going to spend a few minutes on that, okay, 5 or 7, is that all right? And, you know, it's a very interesting kind of history because the resource doesn't exist until the technology exists. So to some extent, the property rights seem to be almost in the equipment rather than in the spectrum itself. But that's probably a misconception. For those of you who don't remember this, the original allocation of the spectrum took place shortly after the Titanic sunk. We had the Communications Act of 1912 in the United States, and what they decided to do was to allocate huge chunks of the spectrum to the most visible user, which was the United States Navy for ship-to-shore technology, and then they put a bunch of other stuff somewhere else. One of the colossal blunders of that particular statute is that they not only designated exclusive rights, but they designated the purposes for which those particular rights should be used. It's as though if you created a system of land, we're saying, well, we're dividing up Brooklyn, and here we got this nice plot of land on 5th Avenue and 42nd Street, and the only thing you could build on to come hell or high water is, in fact, a single-family home, unless you could get some zoning board to approve of the change. Those kinds of rigidities turn out to be absolutely fatal. And if you look at a nice article that Tom Hazlett wrote back in 2005, what it showed you then was the intensity of use of different portions of the spectrum depending upon the uses to which they were assigned. And you look at the spectrum, the sheriff's spectrum, nothing happens. You'll look at the stuff which is used by the cell phone company, it goes up through the roof 3 times over. And yet if you try to switch the one system from the other, it turns out there's no effective way to do it because you need to get FCC approval, and they are, I'm sorry to say, on these kinds of issues, retrograde, not only because of what they think, but because of what Congress thinks behind them. Anybody who looks at Tom Wheeler's fantasy history of why it is that we need net neutrality and goes back to the stuff about telephony in the 1950s and 1960s will know that the single greatest obstructive force with respect to new technology was none other than the FCC itself, working in combination with the dominant carrier of the time, AT&T. So you really like the bottoms-up system because what that does is gives you strong property rights, and in effect of the traditional land rights, you can change uses and technologies without getting approval by government. And that was in fact done from about 1920 to 1925, but they had no interference constraint built into the system. So it became quote-unquote chaos in an age in which you could not interleaf the technologies one to another. And who comes to the rescue? Why, it turns out it's Herbert Hoover, who is Secretary of the Commerce. Now, what most people don't know is 1926 is a double bad year. Hoover was also the driving force behind the uniform zoning laws that were introduced in the United States. He couldn't pass them because there was no federal power to do it, but he was a great central planner in those particular days, and he could control the radio, and all of a sudden we get to the spectrum, public interest, convenience, and necessity, and all the rigidities that are built into that particular system. Now, what do you want to do? Well, you don't want to keep this thing entirely as a commons, because if you keep it as a commons, you get the light square fiasco. I should tell you I've actually worked on the case, and the single largest problem there, well, there are many of them. One of them is the trespass rules don't apply to government agencies, so when they start listening on your areas, they can shut you down instead of shutting themselves down, and they could go to Congress with a special bill to make sure that you can't reverse the FCC position unless you go through hearings after hearings. You drive Light Squared into bankruptcy. You create a Donnybrook, which I will not begin to discuss, which will go on for years trying to pick up the pieces. You prevent the creation of a third television or network, which would be a client to Qualcomm and a competitor to Verizon, so there are all sorts of ambiguities of this. And, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I think sometimes competitors are a good thing. You just expand the overall capacity. But you just got it wrong, and what was the mistake? Well, if the GPS is very important, and we know that it is, and they want to listen in on somebody else's territory, what they have to do is to compensate them for the opportunity costs that happened. Well, those include $2 billion worth of front-end investments and probably $15 billion worth of property. But on the other hand, there's nothing which says you have to live in on those spectrum. What you could start doing is putting more precise equipment in there, narrow the amount of stuff that you need, create multiple compatibilities because we have this technology which allows things to be shared. None of this would be done by the government or by the GPS companies if, in fact, they could keep it for free. And so this is an area in which the just compensation laws are absolutely needed in order to make them put their money where their mouth is. There is no self-evident truth as to which of these two values is the greater. And in fact, the old FCC rules, which says we regulate admissions and you figure out receivers, is the correct rule. Because you don't want to have split authority on this stuff, too much discretion. What you really want, I think, are trespass-type rules can go this far to the boundary and not any further. And so what happens is you also don't want to have weak licenses. And what does that mean? You don't want the government to be able to say, well, this is a license, all licenses are revocable, you get no protection against us, because then they will behave in ways that are unduly responsive to political industry. Now, does this mean, one might add, that we always want to have only private rights in the spectrum? And the answer turns out to be no. It's again the same kind of trade-off. Is the cost of licensing sufficiently high relative to the uses that you're trying to create? And as I recall during the discussion, Charlotte started to talk about the fact, she said, look, remember, most of the unauthorized spectrum are overlay use, in which you put two devices like this, right? Remember that? Well, that's exactly what it is. It's door openers and stuff like that. You've got 1 billion people using these kinds of things. The interference risk, if you keep the frequencies down to a particularly low level, are very, very low. Putting a licensing system in place may be a source of revenue, but it's mainly a source of holdup. You don't want to do it. Now, the question then is, do you want to go beyond that? And we heard something about this 5 gigahertz band, about which I knew nothing before I came here. But I basically take the point very seriously. We have a spectrum, 95% of it, which is allocated in terms of exclusivity. And it turns out, I think it works pretty well over that domain. But I'm not confident enough about the way in which the world is going to be organized in rapidly changing technologies to say that you own to have it all in that particular mode. After all, when you go back to Justinian, some of it was in common, some of it's private. So if we've got a private band out there in which self-organization takes place, we start to think of you guys the way we think of the Frand organization. Somehow or other, mutually assured destruction doesn't seem to work. It's a messy process, but you seem to work this stuff out. And if it's not broken, you don't want to fix it by forcing privatization or licensing requirements on it. And in fact, if the experiment works well and you have to release some other portion of the spectrum, you may say, we're going to do it there as well. What clearly happens is, with respect to the big parts of the spectrum, if you give people flexibility with respect to technologies you have on the new broadband licenses, but not the old TV licenses, and in effect you allow them to subcontract out, you're going to get much more efficient uses than you are. So let me just end with my favorite dumb case by the FCC to show you the dangers of what happens when you don't believe in property rights. It's the case called Cosmopolitan Broadcast Company against the FCC. Now, the Cosmopolitan Broadcast Company was designed to answer a very important public question. Namely, the question was how it is we get minority voices on the radio when you have ABC, NBC, and all these big stations catering to the median voter. And what they did is they subleased spectrum to various guys. So you had 1 hour for the Greek shows and 2 hours for the Spanish shows. They had 27 different languages on these things at their appointed time, each of which got them a readership or an audience. They could advise. They had advertisement, perfectly viable. So what does the FCC think about this innovation? Does anyone know the answer? They shut it down. Well, why did they shut it down? Because they said it is the duty of a broadcaster to determine content, and you cannot delegate that to a bunch of random individuals, and so therefore it's illegal. And this starts to show you what happens. Subcontracting is a key feature of property rights. If you can divide something more efficiently and use it in two parts instead of one, you want it. That's exactly the same problem of division that you have with respect to the water rights. So if you put this all together, the basic conclusion is as follows. When you run a system, there are always the trade-offs between open access on the one hand, which allows for communication across various areas, and exclusivity on the others, which allows for intensive development of a particular resource without it being pulled out from underneath you. On the public side, you have to figure out how you support that infrastructure, and that's a serious question. And on the private side, you have to figure out the restrictions on use, trespass, nuisance law, and so forth. That's a particular problem. But if you understand what the two extremes are, what the trade-offs are, then you start to be able to inch yourself to better solutions in the interim space without putting yourself in the position where you now become a champion of one kind of use over another kind of use. If you're an academic, the first thing you have to remember is you have no friends. And on that glorious note, I will leave you. Thank you.
So once again, Richard does not disappoint. How many students are in the audience here? All right, so the goal now is to go next door and have as many of the professionals engage with the students and continue to reflect on the rich tapestry that Richard wove out. I don't think there's anyone here who either understood all the implications of what he said or who agreed with everything he said. And that's what a good closing speech should do. So thank you, Richard. Please join us next door. Thank you, everyone, for a great conference.